So we're going to spend a little bit of time on this first assumption, that vaccines are the primary reason for the dramatic decline of infectious diseases. Primary reason being the operative word there, because that's what the focus is on. And it doesn't matter if you pick up a CDC document, if you pick up a medical journal, if you pick up the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal or the Cleveland Plain Dealer. If there's an article in there about vaccines, somewhere in the first couple of sentences or the first paragraph, they talk about the decline of diseases because of vaccines. In some instances, there is some truth to that. But there's a whole bigger process in terms of declining of the infectious diseases that we need to take a look at. The first and the cornerstone, and I'm going to spend some time talking about smallpox and polio, primarily because as a new parent or somebody that's just getting involved in this issue or starting to investigate it, this is always the place from which it starts. And if you talk to conventional medical doctors or pediatricians or anybody out in the field, this is the cornerstone thing, that if we vaccinated smallpox into oblivion, we can do that with any other type of vaccine. So I think it's important for you to have an understanding of the smallpox vaccination and the smallpox program to sort of understand that cornerstone argument and where it has some holes. The other thing is that the smallpox program is not going to go away, and we're going to spend a few extra minutes talking about that. But first we're going to start with the past. We just got a little bit of a small history of the smallpox vaccine. It was in 1796 that Edward Jenner demonstrated that skin inoculated with cowpox, that's not smallpox, but cowpox, provided some protection against what was perceived to be a smallpox infection. In the 1800s, it was the first reported case of smallpox vaccination here in the United States, and by the 1940s, okay, that was 140 years later, they had figured out a way to commercially manufacture this. A couple years later, the Pan American Sanitary Organization initiated a worldwide eradication program. And then by 1970, worldwide vaccination program had been going on for more than 100 years, but it was still failing. There were huge outbreaks that were still going on. And for example, outbreaks were happening in India with greater than an 88% vaccination rate. And most of the CDC's materials say that if the vaccination rate is above 85%, that should control epidemics and outbreaks. Well, we've been doing this now for almost 200 years, and we still hadn't eradicated smallpox. It was going away, but it really hadn't been vaccinated away. And there are some materials that suggest that worldwide, at any given time, over the entire world, while they were undergoing this vaccination process, only approximately 10% of the worldwide population ever received a smallpox vaccine. So it wasn't that every single human being on the planet ever had the vaccine. Other things were happening to make it go away. So because it really wasn't working, and they were still having these epidemics and these outbreaks in third world country indigenous areas, the CDC decided to change their strategy. So in 1972, what they decided to do was they developed a program called surveillance and containment, which what they would do is they would go into these third world countries in these villages, mostly in northern India and China and various countries in Africa, and they would actively seek out people that had smallpox. And what they would do is once they would find someone that had an outbreak of smallpox, they would isolate them or quarantine them, and that they would do something called ring vaccination. So they'd take the whole family and put it in the house or the hut or wherever living conditions that they had, and they would vaccinate all the family members and all their close contacts. Now, once they started doing that, the outbreaks really stopped within about 4 years. And on October 26, 1997, is what is reported to be the last naturally occurring case of smallpox in Somalia. A few years later, in 1980, the World Health Organization announced that smallpox had been eradicated. There was a physician and a researcher named Dr. Tom Mack, who was from the University of Southern California, that was at the CDC meeting in June of 2002, which I actually was there, and presented an argument as to why we should not do mass vaccination of the smallpox vaccine. That was as they were revving that up after 9/11. And so I testified twice at the CDC saying that this was not a good idea and presented all the reasons why it was not a good idea, primarily because of all the immunosuppressed people out there in our world that have cancer and asthma and allergies and are on steroids and immunosuppressive diseases, and that this was a live virus vaccine that could easily be spread from one person to another. Well, while I was at the CDC, Dr. Mack got up and gave a presentation, and one of the things when he started talking was he said, you know, I've probably seen more cases of smallpox, been more involved in the smallpox eradication program than almost anybody in this room. And what I think is that at that point in time, you were hearing all these things in the news about that smallpox uniformly had a 30% death rate. If you got smallpox, anybody got, you know, a population got smallpox, the death rate was 30%. His assessment was that really when there was a lot of smallpox out there in the communities, that the case fatality rate in adults was really much lower than generally advertised, and that's a quote. He said it was really closer to 10 or 15%. And whenever you see death rates from any sort of infectious disease, even though they're statistically listed as that was the cause of death, you never really know what the underlying physiology was of that person who had that. I mean, did that person have cancer? Did they have some other type of chronic disease that getting that infectious just pushed them over the edge? You don't really know. Or was this a normal, healthy person that had no problems and they got a disease and died? So all those numbers are all mixed in together. So you can't really ferret that out. The other thing that he said is that the statistics were loaded with kids and that the average death rate in children was much higher in children under the age of 2. But keep in mind that children under the age of 2 are not eligible for a smallpox vaccine. So they couldn't be vaccinated if the couldn't be vaccinated anyways. And in his opinion, that even without mass vaccination, smallpox would have died out anyway. It was already well on its way out. It just would have taken a little bit longer. And that's a verbatim quote that came out of a transcript of the meeting from the Advisory Committee of Immunization Practices, which was what was happening at that CDC hearing in Atlanta, June 19th and 20th of 2002. It's not possible to get that transcript anymore. After the CDC is required by law, because it's a public domain and a public meeting, they are required by law to keep records of everything, of all the transcripts. Shortly after that meeting, I requested a copy of transcript, which I got, and we started using, a lot of us were using this information to disseminate what they were actually saying at this meeting was things like this. Well, that website and that actual transcript has now been dismantled and taken down off of the CDC website, and there's a summary article written of the meeting, but not the individual quotes and not a lot of the things that actually happened at the meeting, which I just find quite interesting. And this is kind of what Dr. Mack was referring to, that this was what was already happening. This was happening all over the world. This started in 1950, and that by 1972, that 38 countries had already ceased reporting smallpox. Now, some of that may have been due to vaccination, as they're claiming, but what was happening between 1950 and 1972 in third world countries, South America, Africa, China, Southeast Asia, was they were getting education, they were not living in confined spaces anymore, they were getting potable water, there was all sorts of hygienic things that were going on. So this is not just a vaccination issue. This is an all-over world, better food, better hygiene, better education sort of issue that was going on. So if we'd continued this line like right straight out here, this is what would have, I think just supports what Dr. Mack was saying. Viruses and bacteria on the planet have a life cycle. They have, if you look back in the Middle Ages when we had the bubonic plague that was spread by typhus, which was spread by fleas on mice, when we stopped having fleas and mice running all over the place and we started using quarantine, we effectively stopped those epidemics. So epidemics have come and gone over our society for millennium, for hundreds of years. This just sort of shortchanged this a little bit. Now, is there a different premise about this? Well, this is sort of what I think, is that the CDC and the World Health Organization attribute this eradication of smallpox to ring vaccination. That's what they all talk about, is all this, you know, if there was an outbreak, you got to vaccinate everybody around it, that's what stopped the spread. Maybe there's a different premise here, and that premise may be that since infection runs its course, a smallpox infection runs its course in 3 to 6 weeks. That's how long, if you got infected and got the infection, that's how long you would be sick, that perhaps just quarantine would have effectively accomplished the same thing. Maybe it really wasn't the ring vaccination that had that much to do with it. Maybe it just was the fact that they went out and started quarantining people until the infection was over. So with that, how deadly is getting smallpox versus the vaccine? Well, in 1900, this came from a document here in the United States. This comes from an MMR document, Achievements in Public Health, and it was published in April of 1999. And one of the statements in there is that in 1999, there were a little over 21,000 cases of smallpox reported here in the United States, and 894 patients died. Well, if you do the math on that, that's 4.2%. That's not anywhere close to 30%. I think that sort of says a lot. The other thing is that the last reported case of smallpox in the United States was in Texas in about 1940. And one of my premises when I was at the CDC and talking to the clinicians and the physicians and the researchers there is, let's assume that the 30% death rate is true. Let's say that's a true number. Well, that also means you got a 70% survival rate. So are we going to why not bet? If I were a betting person, wouldn't I bet on my health and on my 70% survival rate instead of being feared and scared into this big whole thing about a 30% death rate? And also look at, you know, if we actually knew what the cause of smallpox was, maybe there was something that we could do to treat it. I mean, if the last reported case in the United States was in 1940 and the World Health Organization declared it eradicated in 1980 worldwide, if we knew what caused it here in 2004, maybe we've got some health care things and some drugs and some different types of treatments that we could do to treat that. So I started asking that question, what is the cause of death of smallpox? Because everywhere you read, we're reading at that point in time, and you would read it again today, is that smallpox has a 30% death rate. It's like, well, what are these people dying from? You know, if we know what they're dying from, maybe we can treat it. Well, the answer was it's really unsure. When I asked it at the CDC meeting in St. Louis, nobody knew. Kathy Williams asked it at the Institute of Medicine meeting, nobody knew. I brought it up and asked it again at the meeting in Atlanta, and nobody really seemed to know the answer to that either. It was pretty interesting because I read it into my testimony and I asked that question. I sat down about maybe half an hour later. One of the people on the committee, and there was maybe 30 people sitting up at those tables at that committee, pulled their little microphone up and it said, "Excuse me, Chairman, that was a pretty interesting question. Does anybody really know what the cause of death of smallpox was?" Well, at that point, Dr. D.A. Henderson, who is a colleague and in the same realm as Dr. Tom Mack, they were both part of the eradication program for years, he rather sauntered up to the microphone and said, well, let me see, internal organs we know were seldom involved. It possibly may be due to renal failure and maybe due to immune complex deposition, but the truth is it's a mystery. We really don't know. The documentation isn't very good. You know, we don't really know from medical records what really caused that, so we don't really know. Well, I was sitting next to Kathy Williams, and I said, who is one of the co-founders of the National Vaccine Information Center, and I said, I knew it. They don't know. So that whole premise about the death rate being 30%, they don't know if that's real either. It's just something that's been told over and over and over and over and over and over and over again, and when you repeat the same thing over and over again to enough people, people start to believe it. I said, they really don't know, and that was a quote. That was one of those things that came out of those transcripts. That transcript, that's exactly what he said. So I just really believe that you know, if we have immune complex deposition, what do we treat it with these days? We treat it with high-dose steroids. Can we do something for renal failure? I think so. And the other part of it is that when you really talk about what smallpox really is, smallpox is a skin infection. It's a skin infection. So that's why when Dr. Henderson said, internal organs are rarely involved, it's a skin infection, and that's why when you see those pictures of those people that have really bad smallpox, why some of them look pretty bad, it's a skin infection. Okay, so that's why it looks so bad. The rash begins on the face and the forearms. About 17 days after exposure, the vesicles then become pustules. The pustules then become little bedded nodules and leaving that characteristic scarring after they're healed. So that is something that I think is really important to think about, is that we don't know what the cause of death is. Would the death rate really be that high? You know, what is it? Is it just a skin infection? Is there something else that we can treat it with?